They told us the warriors inside were sleeping, that we were simply maintaining heroes between battles. But I heard him speaking before the final prayer was finished, reciting coordinates to worlds that no longer existed. The rite continued exactly as written. The sarcophagus seal hissed as I broke the third pressure lock, and the air that escaped smelled like copper and rendered fat. My hands moved through the sequence without thought, because thought was not required for this work. Check the left servo coupling. Verify the nutrient line integrity. Recite the third stanza of the Litany of Sustained Vigilance while adjusting the temperature gradient by 0.7 degrees. I had performed these actions 43 times across 6 years of service to the chapter, and each repetition had reinforced the truth that this was sacred work, that my hands touched the very instruments of the Emperor's will, that the warrior entombed within this adamantine shell rested in honored sleep until the moment his strength was needed again. The chamber existed 3 levels below the fortress monastery's main apothecarium, carved directly into the bedrock of a world whose name I had never been permitted to know. The walls were adamantine, scarred by millennia of maintenance, stained black in places where coolant had leaked and been inadequately purged. Overhead lighting came from lumen strips that had been installed and replaced so many times that the ceiling fixtures formed geological layers of mounting brackets and corroded wiring. The heat never varied. It pressed against my skin like a physical weight, thick enough that breathing required conscious effort after the first hour of a shift. The sound was constant, a low mechanical hum that vibrated through the floor and up through the bones of my feet, punctuated at irregular intervals by the hiss of pressure valves and the tick of cooling metal. The rite of reawakening followed a pattern established before my birth, before my father's service, perhaps before the fortress itself had been consecrated. I had been taught the sequence in the serf training halls where we knelt on cold stone and recited until our voices became indistinguishable from one another, until the words lost individual meaning and became pure sound, pure obedience. The rite existed to transition the Dreadnought from dormancy to combat readiness across a precisely measured 72-hour cycle. Each phase had a prescribed duration. Each gesture had a documented purpose. Deviation introduced error, and error introduced the possibility of malfunction. And malfunction meant that a warrior's sacrifice could be diminished by the inadequacy of those who served him. I lit the first candle and placed it in the designated niche to the left of the sarcophagus interface panel. The wax was rendered from animals slaughtered on the day of a great victory whose details I did not know. The flame guttered in the ventilation current, casting shadows that made the sarcophagus seem to shift slightly, though I knew this was impossible. The Dreadnought had been locked into position by mag clamps designed to withstand orbital bombardment. It could not move unless commanded to move. The catechism began with the acknowledgement of service. I spoke the words in High Gothic, my voice flat and steady as prescribed. Honored warrior, we who remain in flesh acknowledge your sacrifice. We who walk beneath open sky acknowledge your eternal vigil. We who possess the weakness of mortality acknowledge the strength of your preservation. The words felt correct in my mouth. They had always felt correct. They were words that meant something, that connected my small function to the vast architecture of the Imperium's war. I believed this completely. The internal vox activated before I finished the second verse. The sound came not through the external speakers mounted on the Dreadnought's chassis, but through the metal itself, a vibration that I felt in my teeth before I heard it as words. The voice was human once, or had contained something human once, but time and modification had stretched it into something else. It recited coordinates in a mechanical monotone, sector designations, planetary classifications, tactical assessments delivered with the precision of a firing solution. None of the locations matched any theater I had been briefed on. None of the unit designations corresponded to active deployments. I continued the catechism without pause because pausing was not part of the procedure. My voice overlapped with the voice from within the sarcophagus, creating a discordant harmony that made my skin contract. The Dreadnought's voice described wounds that I knew from maintenance records I had reviewed during my certification training had been sealed beneath ceramite and adamantine 2 centuries before I was born. It spoke of brothers fallen in battles that had been commemorated with feast days and monument dedications, their names inscribed in marble in the fortress's Hall of Remembrance. The voice was not requesting status. It was not acknowledging my presence. It was simply speaking, as if it had been speaking all along and I had only now entered a position where I could hear it. I completed the acknowledgement of service and moved to the second phase without deviation. My hands activated the cogitator interface and began the diagnostic sequence that would verify neural pathway integrity before the main awakening could proceed. The screen flickered with scrolling data, each line a measurement of synaptic response time, neurotransmitter balance, pain threshold calibration, everything registered within acceptable parameters. The voice continued, now describing the smell of burning flesh and the sound that a human ribcage makes when crushed by power armor's servo-enhanced grip. The tech marine responsible for overseeing this reactivation cycle stood 3 meters behind me and to the left, positioned so that he could observe both my actions and the Dreadnought's status displays without obstruction. He had not moved since the rite began. He had not acknowledged the voice. His own voice, when it came, was modulated by his helm's Vox system into something flat and precise. "Continue," I continued. The second candle went into its niche. The third litany began. My training had been explicit about the purpose of each component of the rite. The candles represented the light of the Emperor's guidance, penetrating even the darkness of death. The litanies served to remind the warrior within of his oaths, his chapter, his purpose. The technical procedures ensured that the biological components remained viable and that the mechanical systems interfaced correctly with what remained of the warrior's nervous system. Everything had a reason. Everything had been tested across thousands of reawakenings. The procedure worked because it had always worked. The Dreadnought's voice shifted without warning to a language I did not recognize. Harsh syllables that might have been a battle cry or a prayer, or simply the sound that pain makes when filtered through a mechanical Vox system and sustained for longer than a human throat could endure. The sound lasted 14 seconds. I counted them automatically while my hands moved through the prescribed sequence of pressure checks on the nutrient feeds that sustained what remained of the warrior's organic systems. When the sound stopped, the silence that followed felt deliberate, as if something had made a choice to cease rather than simply running out of whatever energy had fueled it. I found myself waiting for it to resume. My hands had paused over the third nutrient line coupling. The pause lasted less than 2 seconds before I corrected it, but the tech marine's helm turned slightly in my direction. He said nothing. The correction had been fast enough to fall within acceptable tolerances, but I had been noticed. I finished the nutrient line verification and applied the purity seals to each connection point, speaking the blessing of sustained function as I worked. The seals were wax and parchment, inscribed with prayers in a hand so small and precise that I suspected a servitor had written them. They would prevent contamination for exactly as long as the Dreadnought remained within controlled atmospheric conditions, which meant they were functionally useless but ritually essential. I understood this. The Imperium operated on the understanding that spiritual hygiene mattered as much as physical hygiene, that the proper forms must be observed even when the material outcome would remain unchanged. The fourth phase of the rite required direct physical contact with the sarcophagus housing. I placed my bare hand against the adamantine shell where the instructions indicated, feeling the warmth of the internal systems bleeding through metal that should have been cold. The surface was scarred with impacts that had been repaired but never fully erased, testament to battles whose specifics had been recorded in tactical archives I would never be permitted to access. My palm registered a faint vibration, steady and rhythmic. It matched a human heartbeat. I had been told during training that any vibration detected through the sarcophagus shell was servo-calibration feedback, the mechanical systems adjusting themselves in preparation for full activation. I had been told this by an instructor whose own service record included 12 years of Dreadnought maintenance. I had no reason to doubt this explanation. I recited the fifth litany while my hand remained in contact with the shell, feeling the pulse continue with perfect regularity, never varying, never stopping. The Dreadnought's voice resumed mid-sentence, as if no time had passed. It was explaining how to identify a Xenos infiltrator by the pattern of their breathing, the specific chemical signature their fear produced, the optimal grip points for removing a head from a spine with bare hands. The voice held no emotion. It delivered this information with the same inflection it had used for coordinates and tactical assessments. It did not pause. It did not acknowledge that I was listening or that anyone had ever listened. I removed my hand from the shell when the prescribed duration elapsed. The warmth remained on my palm for several minutes afterward, a ghost of contact that faded so gradually I could not identify the exact moment it disappeared. The tech marine moved for the first time since the rite had begun, stepping forward to examine the cogitator readouts directly. His armor, painted in the red of his calling, bore honor markings I could not interpret and service studs that indicated centuries of function. He studied the data for 37 seconds, then returned to his observation position without comment. The data was acceptable. The rite was proceeding correctly. I believed this because I had no framework for believing anything else. The training I had received before being assigned to Dreadnought maintenance had lasted 4 months and encompassed both technical instruction and spiritual preparation. We had been taught the sacred nature of our work in the same breath as the proper torque specifications for sarcophagus mounting bolts. The chapter's chaplains had visited our instruction sessions to remind us that we served not merely machines but heroes, warriors who had chosen eternal service over the peace of death, whose sacrifice deserved reverence and precision in equal measure. The doctrinal foundation was simple. A space marine who sustained injuries too severe for even the apothecary's skills could volunteer to continue his service by being interred within a Dreadnought chassis. The process was described as a choice, an honor extended only to those whose valor and loyalty had been proven beyond question. Once sealed within the sarcophagus, the warrior would sleep, his consciousness preserved in a state of rest, awakened only when the chapter required his strength and experience on the battlefield. Between deployments, he would dream of past glories, his mind maintained in a state of peaceful contemplation by systems designed specifically for that purpose. This was the truth I had been given. This was the truth I had internalized so completely that it shaped how I interpreted every aspect of my work. When I checked the chemical balance of the amniotic suspension that surrounded what remained of the warrior's body, I understood this as ensuring comfortable rest. When I verified that the pain management systems were functioning within parameters, I understood this as maintaining the dignity of a hero's repose. When I recited the litanies, I understood myself to be offering respect to one who had earned it through sacrifice I could barely comprehend. The doctrine accounted for every question before the question could fully form. Why did the Dreadnought require such extensive maintenance if it was merely sleeping? Because the systems were ancient and sacred, deserving of constant care. Why did the reactivation rite take 72 hours instead of happening instantly? Because proper preparation honored the warrior and ensured his optimal function in battle. Why were we forbidden to speak to the Dreadnought except through prescribed litanies? Because our voices were unworthy of casual conversation with one so elevated, and because the forms had been established by those wiser than ourselves. I had never questioned these answers because questioning them would have required me to believe that the chapter's tech marines and chaplains, warriors who had served for centuries, who had access to knowledge and authority far beyond my comprehension, had constructed doctrine that was somehow flawed or incomplete. The alternative was to trust that my limited perspective could not grasp the full truth, that my obedience was more valuable than my understanding. This trust had made the work bearable. It had made the heat and the isolation and the endless repetition feel like participation in something greater than myself. When I returned to the serf quarters after a maintenance shift and lay in my assigned cot listening to the fortress's ventilation systems cycle through their patterns, I had felt satisfaction in knowing that my hands had helped preserve a warrior's rest, that I had performed my small function in the vast machinery of the Imperium's eternal war. The sixth phase required me to interface directly with the neural monitoring system. The cogitator screen displayed a schematic of the warrior's remaining nervous tissue, color-coded to indicate activity levels in different regions. Most of the diagram was gray, indicating dormancy. Small clusters of yellow marked areas of minimal background function, the automatic processes that kept organic tissue alive. I was supposed to verify that no red zones appeared, red indicating active distress that would require immediate intervention. The entire diagram was red. I stared at the screen for 3 seconds before checking the display settings, certain that I had misread the color calibration or that the cogitator was malfunctioning. The settings were correct. The reading was accurate. Every monitored section of the warrior's nervous system was registering active distress at levels that the system's designers had marked as requiring immediate medical intervention. The readings indicated conscious awareness, pain response, elevated stress hormones, accelerated synaptic firing consistent with panic or combat readiness. The readings indicated that the warrior inside the sarcophagus was awake and suffering. I turned to report this to the tech marine, the words already forming in my mouth, but he spoke first. Proceed to Phase 7. His tone did not invite discussion. I looked at the screen again, at the red zones that covered the neural map like a wound. The readings were clear, the distress markers were unambiguous. This was not dormancy, this was not rest. This was a human nervous system experiencing conditions that would have driven an unmodified human into shock or unconsciousness, except the modifications prevented unconsciousness, prevented retreat, prevented anything except continued awareness of the pain. The neural readings show. Proceed to Phase 7. The tech marine had not moved. His helm remained fixed in my direction. I understood then that he had already seen the readings. He had reviewed them during his 37-second examination of the cogitator output. He had categorized them as acceptable. The rite was proceeding correctly, because the rite's correctness was not determined by the comfort of the warrior within, but by the functionality of the systems that would allow him to fight when commanded to fight. I proceeded to Phase 7. The words of the 7th litany felt different in my mouth than they had during training. I had recited this same litany dozens of times, had practiced it until the high Gothic syllables flowed without conscious thought. But now, speaking them while the neural monitor screamed silent red testimony to agony, the words revealed themselves as something other than what I had believed. I was not offering comfort to one who rested. I was not honoring peaceful contemplation. I was participating in a mechanism designed to maintain suffering at precisely calibrated levels. The litany thanked the warrior for his sacrifice. It praised his endurance. It assured him that his service was valued and necessary. The words were true, but the truth they contained was not the truth I had believed I was speaking. My hands moved through the physical components of Phase 7 while my mouth continued the litany. I adjusted the interface connections that linked the sarcophagus to the Dreadnought's external armor and weapons systems. Each connection was a pathway through which the warrior's will would be translated into action, his thoughts converted into targeting solutions and weapon discharges, and the movement of adamantine limbs. The connections were neural interfaces that bypassed what remained of his organic body entirely, reading his intentions directly from his brain tissue and executing them through the machine. As I secured each connection, I felt the faint vibration of neural activity through the interface ports. The warrior inside was thinking, his consciousness generating signals that the machine dutifully recorded and prepared to translate into violence. He was not dormant. He had never been dormant. The systems I was connecting had no provision for dormancy because they had been designed under the assumption that the warrior would always be conscious, always aware, always ready to receive the command to fight. The voice from within the sarcophagus had gone silent during the 7th phase, but the silence felt worse than the speaking had. It was the silence of something waiting, something conserving its energy, not because it had been granted rest, but because it had learned through experience that rest would not be granted and screaming achieved nothing. I completed the 7th phase, and logged the results in the cogitator, following the prescribed format. Each field had a specific purpose: status, nominal, neural interface, integrity, verified. Estimated time to full combat readiness, 41 hours, 17 minutes. I entered the data mechanically, my fingers finding the keys through muscle memory while my thoughts moved in directions that my training had never prepared me for. If the warrior had been awake this entire time, if the distress readings were not an anomaly but the intended state, then everything I had been told about the nature of Dreadnought service was not wrong so much as incomplete. The warrior had volunteered, yes. The preservation was an honor, yes. But the honor came at a cost that had been carefully obscured by doctrine, buried beneath ritual and procedure, and the assumption that those who served the chapter did so willingly at any price. The 8th phase was routine maintenance, physical verification of the external chassis while the neural systems stabilized. I moved around the Dreadnought with a handheld Auspex, scanning for microfractures in the armor plating and stress points in the joint assemblies. The machine stood 4 meters tall, its silhouette dominated by the weapons mounted on its arms and the sarcophagus embedded in its torso. Every surface bore the marks of combat: las-burn scars, impact craters, patches where armor had been replaced or reinforced. The chapter's heraldry was painted on the shoulder plates, colors still bright despite the damage surrounding them. The Auspex registered normal background radiation, residual heat from standby systems, and the faint electromagnetic signature of active cogitator banks. It also registered something the training manuals had not mentioned: a low-frequency vibration emanating from the sarcophagus that matched no mechanical system I had been taught to identify. The frequency was irregular, rising and falling in patterns that suggested biological origin. It was the kind of sound that a human diaphragm might produce if it were trying to breathe against restraints that prevented full lung expansion, if it were attempting to draw air through tubes and filters that measured and controlled every breath. I documented the vibration in my log, describing it in technical terms as anomalous resonance pattern, source unidentified, no impact on combat readiness. The tech marine would review the log later. He would see the same description. He would categorize it as acceptable variation within normal operating parameters. The rite would continue. The candles had burned down to half their original height, the wax pooling in the niches and solidifying into shapes that resembled frozen tears. The heat in the chamber had increased as the Dreadnought systems came further online, each active component adding its own contribution to the ambient temperature. My skin was slick with sweat that evaporated almost immediately in the dry air, leaving salt residue that made my uniform cling and rasp against my shoulders. I had learned to ignore thirst during maintenance shifts. Water was available, but accessing it meant pausing the rite, and pausing meant extending the total duration, and the 72-hour window was absolute. The Tech Marine's Vox crackled once, a brief burst of static that might have been an internal communication or might have been simple interference. He did not move otherwise. His attention remained fixed on me and on the Dreadnought, his presence a constant pressure that shaped my actions more effectively than any spoken command. I did not need to be told to work faster or more carefully. His observation alone was sufficient to ensure my compliance with every documented standard. Phase 9 was neural synchronization, the most delicate portion of the entire rite. The warrior's consciousness had to be fully integrated with the Dreadnought's tactical systems. His awareness expanded to encompass the machine's sensors and weapons and the squad-level communication networks he would interface with during deployment. The process required me to manually adjust synaptic relay coefficients while monitoring feedback levels to ensure that the integration did not overwhelm the warrior's remaining biological capacity for processing information. I had performed this procedure before. I had been trained to recognize the optimal feedback levels to make the adjustments with precision and care. What I had never been trained for was performing the procedure while understanding what it actually meant. while knowing that I was deliberately expanding a conscious human being's awareness to include systems designed to process battlefield data at rates that would destroy an unmodified mind. The first relay coefficient required adjustment at the 9-minute mark of the synchronization phase. I made the change using the interface controls, increasing the signal strength by 0.3%. The neural monitor showed immediate response. Activity levels surged in the prefrontal cortex and temporal lobes, the areas responsible for decision-making and spatial awareness. The red zones deepened to a shade that the color scale labeled as critical distress. The warrior was experiencing the expansion of his consciousness into the machine, feeling his awareness stretch to encompass sensor feeds and targeting matrices and threat assessment algorithms. He was experiencing this while fully conscious, while aware enough to understand what was happening, while unable to resist or refuse, because the systems that controlled his body had been specifically designed to override any biological impulse towards self-preservation. I made the second adjustment, the third, the fourth. Each change expanded his awareness further, forcing his mind to process more data, to maintain coherent thought while his sense of self dissolved into the machine's distributed systems. The neural monitor showed patterns I had been trained to recognize as successful integration. The patterns looked identical to what I imagined a mind would produce while tearing itself apart, trying to encompass something too large for human neurology to contain. The voice returned during the 13th adjustment. It came through the external speakers this time, not the metal itself, and it was screaming. Not words, not language, just sound, raw and unfiltered, the kind of noise that a human throat should not be able to produce, sustained beyond any breath capacity, mechanically amplified until it filled the chamber and resonated in the bones of my skull. The tech marine did not react. I did not stop working. The scream continued for 47 seconds, then cut off with the abruptness of a severed cable. The silence that followed was worse. It was the silence of something that had been forcibly muted, not something that had chosen to stop. I completed the neural synchronization phase. The cogitator confirmed successful integration. The warrior's consciousness was now properly distributed across the Dreadnought systems, his ability to process tactical information enhanced to the levels required for effective combat operation. The cost of this enhancement was displayed in the neural monitor's readings, but the readings were categorized as nominal because they fell within the expected parameters for a successfully synchronized Dreadnought. Expected. Parameters. The words meant that someone had established what range of suffering was acceptable, had documented it, had enshrined it in technical specifications that future generations of tech marines would reference when performing this same procedure on other warriors. The suffering was not an accident or a malfunction, it was a design feature. Phase 10 through Phase 15 passed in a sequence of increasingly mechanical actions. I no longer needed to reference my training materials. My hands moved through the required gestures, my voice spoke the prescribed litanies, my eyes verified the data that confirmed each phase's success. The distinction between myself and the tools I was using began to blur. I was not making decisions. I was executing a program, following instructions that had been written before I was born and would continue to be followed after I was gone. The Dreadnought's voice provided intermittent commentary throughout these phases, sometimes coherent, sometimes fragmented. It recited the chapter's founding principles. It named battles from the Horus Heresy. It described the taste of orc blood and the sound that a Chaos Marine's armor makes when crushed by a power fist. It apologized to battle brothers whose names I did not recognize for failures whose nature it did not explain. It confessed to moments of weakness, hesitation before a charge, mercy shown to an enemy who begged, doubt about the righteousness of a particular action. Each confession was delivered in the same mechanical monotone. Each apology contained no expectation of forgiveness. The warrior inside the sarcophagus was not seeking absolution. He was simply speaking, filling the time between one moment of forced service and the next with words that might once have meant something but had been repeated so many times that they had worn smooth, become ritual themselves, empty sounds produced by a consciousness that had nothing else to do with its awareness. At the 37-hour mark, a chaplain entered the chamber to deliver the blessing of righteous purpose. His skull helm reflected the candlelight, the eye lenses glowing faintly red with internal illumination. He carried a Crozius Arcanum, the weapon's eagle-shaped head etched with prayers too small for me to read at this distance. His armor was black, marked with purity seals and oath papers that documented a service record spanning centuries. The chaplain's arrival required me to pause the current phase and step back from the Dreadnought. I moved to the designated waiting position, standing with my hands clasped behind my back and my eyes fixed on the floor. The chaplain's footsteps were heavy, each impact of his armored boots against the stone floor a measured rhythm that spoke of absolute certainty. He had walked this same path hundreds of times before. He would walk it hundreds of times again. He stopped before the Dreadnought and raised his Crozius. The eagle's wings spread as if preparing for flight. His voice, amplified by his armor's Vox system, filled the chamber with words that I recognized from the chapter's most sacred texts. "Brother, do you persist in faith?" The response came immediately from the Dreadnought speakers. "I persist." "Do you serve the Emperor without doubt?" "I serve without doubt." "Do you embrace your burden willingly?" There was a pause. It lasted less than a second, but I noticed it. The chaplain noticed it. The Tech Marine, still standing in his observation position, shifted his weight slightly. The pause was an anomaly, a deviation from the prescribed rhythm of call and response. "I embrace my burden willingly." The words were correct, but the pause had revealed something. The warrior inside the sarcophagus had hesitated. He had considered the question before answering. The consideration meant he retained enough independent thought to recognize that he was being asked to confirm something, that he still possessed the theoretical capacity to answer differently, even if the systems that controlled his body would never permit a different answer to translate into action. The chaplain continued the blessing, his words covering the hesitation, restoring the ritual's proper flow. He recited the chapter's founding principles. He praised the warrior's sacrifice. He assured the entombed brother that his service was valued, that his suffering was meaningful, that his duty would never end because the enemies of mankind would never cease their attacks, and the Imperium would always require warriors willing to pay any price for humanity's continued existence. The blessing was structured as reassurance, but listening to it while standing in this chamber, while aware of what the neural monitors revealed, while having heard the sounds that came from within the sarcophagus, I understood it differently. The blessing was not offering comfort, it was reinforcing compliance. It was reminding the warrior that he had chosen this fate, that his volunteering had been an act of faith, that any suffering he experienced was noble and sanctified and necessary. The blessing made the suffering the warrior's own responsibility. He had volunteered, he persisted willingly. Any doubt was a failure of his own faith, not a flaw in the system that maintained him in this state. The structure was perfect. It absolved the chapter of any responsibility while ensuring that the warrior could never articulate objection without simultaneously confessing spiritual failure. The chaplain concluded the blessing and departed without acknowledging my presence. His footsteps receded down the corridor, the sound fading until only the chamber's background hum remained. I returned to my workstation and resumed the interrupted phase. The Tech Marine had not moved. The rite continued. At the 41-hour mark, I was required to replenish the amniotic suspension that surrounded the warrior's organic remains. The procedure involved draining the existing fluid through a series of filtration systems, analyzing the chemical composition for signs of tissue degradation or infection, then refilling the sarcophagus with fresh suspension mixed to precise specifications. The process was automatic once initiated, controlled by cogitator systems that had been programmed centuries ago, but it required monitoring to ensure proper flow rates and to verify that the filtration systems were removing waste products effectively. I initiated the drain sequence and watched the fluid level indicator drop. The suspension was supposed to be clear with a slight amber tint, but what drained into the collection reservoir was darker, almost brown, with visible particulates suspended throughout. The chemical analysis came back showing elevated protein levels and metabolic waste concentrations far above the acceptable range. The warrior's organic tissue was breaking down faster than the maintenance systems could repair it. This information was automatically logged in the maintenance database, categorized under normal operational variants, and flagged for review during the next scheduled major overhaul. The flag meant that in approximately 7 months, when the Dreadnought was next pulled from active deployment for extended maintenance, a tech marine would examine the deterioration and make adjustments to the cellular regeneration protocols. Until then, the warrior would continue to function. The deterioration was progressing slowly enough that it would not prevent combat deployment. The suffering it caused was not relevant to operational readiness. I prepared the fresh suspension according to the specifications, mixing the base compounds with nutrients and chemical stabilizers in the prescribed ratios. The mixture had to be heated to exactly 37.2 degrees before introduction to avoid thermal shock to the remaining tissue. While the heating process cycled, I cleaned the filtration systems, removing the accumulated waste and disposing of it in the designated biohazard containers. The waste included fragments of human tissue, too small to identify specifically, suspended in fluid that had once been part of a living body's circulatory system. I had disposed of similar waste during previous maintenance cycles. I had understood it as the natural byproduct of preserving tissue across centuries, the cost of maintaining biological systems in an environment they had not evolved to survive. That understanding had allowed me to perform the disposal without revulsion because it had been framed as necessary maintenance, the same as replacing a worn gasket or purging a corroded fuel line. But now, holding a container of waste that had recently been part of a conscious human being, that had been broken down by cellular processes happening inside a body that could feel those processes occurring, the revulsion came anyway. I disposed of the waste mechanically, following the procedure, but my hands were shaking when I returned to the control panel. The fresh suspension filled the sarcophagus slowly, the level indicator rising with the same steady pace it had shown during every previous replenishment I had performed. When the process was 70% complete, the Dreadnought speakers activated again. "It burns." The voice was different this time. Quieter, more human. Less filtered by mechanical distortion. It sounded like someone speaking through pain they had learned to endure but never learned to ignore. "It burns. It always burns. It will always burn." The statement was not a complaint. It was not a request for intervention. It was simply an observation, delivered with the flat certainty of someone describing an unchangeable fact about their existence. The warrior inside the sarcophagus was telling me something he knew and I had not yet fully grasped. The pain was permanent, it was intentional, and it would never stop because the systems had been designed to sustain it indefinitely. I completed the replenishment procedure. The level indicator reached 100%. The sarcophagus sealed automatically, pressure locks engaging with their characteristic hiss. The neural monitor showed a brief spike in activity as the fresh suspension made contact with exposed nerve tissue, then settled back into the red patterns that had become familiar over the past 41 hours. The 48th hour brought a change in the tech marine's behavior. He moved from his observation position and approached the Dreadnought directly, placing one gauntleted hand against the sarcophagus shell in what might have been a gesture of respect, or simply a method of feeling the vibrations directly. He stood there for 93 seconds, motionless, except for the minute adjustments his armor's gyroscopic stabilizers made to maintain his balance. Then he removed his hand and returned to his position. He had felt what I had felt earlier, the rhythmic pulse that matched a heartbeat, the vibrations that suggested breathing against resistance, the proof that something living and aware remained within the metal shell. The difference was that when he felt these things, he categorized them as confirmation of proper function. The warrior was alive. The warrior was conscious. Therefore, the systems were working as designed. I envied him for a moment. This certainty, the ability to experience the same sensations I had experienced and draw from them conclusions that aligned perfectly with doctrine, that created no friction between belief and observation. He had either never questioned the nature of Dreadnought service or had questioned it and found answers that satisfied him completely. Either way, he could stand in this chamber and perform his duties without the weight of understanding that had begun pressing against my thoughts. At the 51st hour, I was required to test the Dreadnought's weapon systems. The procedure involved activating each weapon in sequence, running diagnostic cycles that verified firing mechanisms and ammunition feeds without actually discharging the weapons. The assault cannon mounted on the right arm cycled through its rotation test, the barrel spinning with increasing velocity until it became a blur. The cogitator reported nominal function. The heavy flamer on the left arm pressurized its fuel system, building pressure to the threshold of ignition but not crossing it. The cogitator reported nominal function. Each weapon's test sent signals through the neural interface, informing the warrior inside that his ability to inflict violence remained intact. His consciousness registered these signals and prepared to translate them into action when commanded. The tests were not preparing the weapons for battle. They were preparing the warrior to accept that his purpose had not changed, that his existence remained defined by his capacity for destruction, that he would continue to serve in this capacity until the systems failed or the enemies of mankind were finally exterminated. The enemies of mankind would never be exterminated. The Imperium had fought for 10,000 years, and the wars only multiplied. The warrior inside this sarcophagus would serve until his biological tissue finally degraded beyond the point where the regeneration systems could sustain it, at which point he would be honored with funeral rites, and a new warrior would volunteer to take his place. Believing the same things I had believed before this shift began, the cycle would continue. It had to continue. The Imperium required warriors, and warriors eventually fell, and the Dreadnoughts allowed service to extend beyond the normal limits of mortality. The logic was perfect. The necessity was absolute. The cost was hidden beneath doctrine and ritual, and the assumption that those who volunteered understood what they were volunteering for. But I was beginning to suspect that they did not understand, that they could not understand, because understanding would make volunteering impossible for anyone not already broken by faith into something that valued duty above consciousness itself. The 56th hour brought the first signs of physical deterioration in my own function. I had been awake for 56 continuous hours, permitted only brief moments to consume nutrient paste and recycle waste fluids. The chapter did not require me to operate at peak efficiency, only to operate within acceptable parameters. My hands still moved with sufficient precision. My voice still recited the litanies correctly. The fact that my vision occasionally blurred, or that I sometimes lost several seconds to a fugue state where my body continued working while my consciousness retreated, was not relevant as long as the work continued. I understood that I was being conditioned. Every hour in this chamber, every moment of sustained obedience despite exhaustion and doubt, reinforced the patterns that made me useful to the chapter. I was learning to ignore my body's protests, to continue functioning past the point where continuation should be possible, to separate my thoughts from my actions so completely that one could proceed without the other. I was becoming more like the warrior inside the Dreadnought, a consciousness trapped in a system designed to extract function regardless of cost, sustained by rituals that framed suffering as service and endurance as faith. The realization did not produce rebellion. It produced a strange kind of calm. If my fate was to serve until service destroyed me, then struggling against that fate was simply another form of suffering to be endured. The only path that reduced total suffering was acceptance, compliance, the surrender of any expectation that my existence would contain anything except obedience and the brief intervals between one act of obedience and the next. At the 61st hour, the tech marine left the chamber. He departed without explanation or instruction, his heavy footsteps receding down the corridor until the sound was swallowed by the fortress's ambient noise. I was alone with the Dreadnought for the first time since the rite had begun. The solitude changed nothing about my duties. I continued the current phase, adjusting the final parameters that would complete the integration of the Dreadnought's secondary tactical systems. But without the Techmarine's presence, the chamber felt different. The pressure of observation had lifted, replaced by a different kind of pressure. The awareness that the Dreadnought and I were the only conscious beings in this space, that any sound I made would be heard only by the warrior inside the sarcophagus, that I could, theoretically, speak to him directly, instead of through prescribed litanies. I did not speak. The prohibition against casual conversation with the Dreadnought had not been lifted simply because the Techmarine was absent. The prohibition existed not to protect the Dreadnought from my unworthy words, but to protect me from saying something that might reveal doubt or elicit a response that contradicted doctrine. The structure was designed to prevent exactly the kind of conversation that might lead to dangerous questions. But I could hear the Dreadnought's breathing now, or the mechanical approximation of breathing, the regulated intake and exhalation of air through filters and tubes. The rhythm was steady but not natural, paced by systems that controlled it with the same precision they controlled every other biological function. I listened to this rhythm while I worked, and I understood that the warrior inside was listening to me as well, tracking my movements by sound, aware of my presence the same way I was aware of his. The connection was not comfort, it was shared imprisonment, two consciousnesses locked into functions that neither of us had chosen and that neither of us could escape. At the 64th hour, I accessed the maintenance archives. The cogitator terminal in the corner of the chamber contained records of every maintenance cycle performed on this specific Dreadnought since its initial consecration 274 years ago. The records were organized by date, each entry documenting the procedures performed, the readings obtained, and any anomalies observed during that cycle. I began reading through the entries, searching for something I could not specifically name. Confirmation, perhaps, or evidence that what I had observed during this cycle was unique, an aberration that would justify reporting it and seeking clarification from higher authority. What I found was repetition. Every cycle documented the same neural readings I had observed. Every cycle noted elevated distress markers, chemical imbalances in the amniotic suspension, waste products beyond acceptable concentrations. Every cycle logged these observations and categorized them as within operational parameters, or acceptable variance, or no impact on combat readiness. The archival entries included annotations from the Techmarines who had overseen previous cycles. The annotations used phrases that I recognized from my own training: spiritual fortification through endurance, necessary discomfort to maintain combat edge, pain as focus enhancement. Each phrase reframed suffering as functional, as beneficial, as something the warrior should welcome because it made him a more effective instrument of the Emperor's will. I found entries from 50 years ago that described the same voice patterns I had heard, the same recitations of coordinates and confessions. I found entries from 100 years ago documenting the same hesitation during the chaplain's blessing, the same delay before confirming willing service. The pattern extended back through decades and centuries, an unbroken record of a consciousness maintained in exactly this state, never varying, never improving, never finding any resolution except the temporary unconsciousness of deployment and the return to awareness once the battle ended. The records contained one additional detail that shifted my understanding again. Each entry included a counter that tracked cumulative conscious hours. The Dreadnought was not awakened only for combat deployment. It was awakened for maintenance cycles, for ritual observances, for any occasion where the chapter's tradition required the presence of its honored veterans. The counter showed that across 274 years of service, the warrior inside had been conscious for approximately 68 years. 68 years of awareness, with no sleep, no true rest. No moment when the pain and the duty and the endless processing of tactical data ceased. 68 years of being told that this was an honor, that this was necessary, that this was what he had volunteered for when he had chosen to serve the Emperor. The weight of this information pressed against my thoughts with the same relentless pressure as the chamber's heat. I could not ignore it. I could not reframe it into something acceptable. The numbers were absolute, documented by systems that did not lie and could not be influenced by belief or interpretation. I closed the archive and returned to my current duties. The knowledge I had gained changed nothing about what I was required to do. The rite would continue to its conclusion. The Dreadnought would be deployed when the chapter required its strength. I would perform future maintenance cycles following the same procedures, logging the same observations, contributing to the same eternal record of sustained consciousness and managed suffering. At the 67th hour, a serf I did not recognize entered the chamber carrying a tray of nutrient paste and water. He placed the tray on the designated shelf, then departed without speaking. The prohibition against conversation during active rites applied to all serf interactions, not just those involving the dreadnoughts themselves. I consumed the paste mechanically, tasting nothing, then drank the water in careful measured sips that would not trigger the nausea I could feel hovering at the edge of my awareness. My body was approaching its operational limits, but those limits were further than I had previously believed possible. Exhaustion had become a constant state rather than an escalating condition. Pain from standing and working for 67 hours had settled into a background sensation that I could acknowledge without allowing it to slow my movements. I was discovering the same truth the warrior in the Dreadnought had learned: that consciousness could persist in conditions that should destroy it, that the body would continue functioning long after the mind believed continuation was impossible. This discovery did not make me stronger. It made me aware of how much further I could fall before function actually ceased. The 71st hour brought the final integration test. I activated all of the Dreadnought systems simultaneously, creating a full combat simulation where sensors, weapons, communication networks, and tactical processing systems operated together as they would during actual deployment. The warrior's consciousness had to coordinate all of these systems while maintaining coherent thought and responding to simulated battlefield conditions generated by the cogitator. The test lasted 14 minutes. During that time, I watched the neural monitor display patterns that I had learned to interpret as maximum stress. The warrior was experiencing the full weight of his augmented awareness, processing threat assessments and targeting solutions and squad communication protocols, while simultaneously managing the pain of his deteriorating tissue and the knowledge that this test was only preparation for actual combat, where the stress would be sustained not for 14 minutes, but for hours or days. The Dreadnought passed the test. All systems performed within expected parameters. The warrior demonstrated appropriate response times and tactical decision-making. The machine and the man were properly synchronized. When the test concluded, the neural monitor did not return to its previous levels. The stress remained elevated, locked into the new baseline that the test had established. The warrior had been permanently changed by those 14 minutes. His consciousness had been stretched again, forced to encompass more data, to operate at higher intensity. The change was irreversible. Each deployment would require the same intensity, and each deployment would leave him further from whatever baseline of self he had possessed before the first awakening. At the 72nd hour, the rite concluded. I spoke the final litany, applied the last purity seal, logged the completion codes in the cogitator, and stepped back from the Dreadnought. The machine stood ready, fully integrated, prepared for immediate deployment when the chapter issued the command. My part in its preparation was complete. The tech marine returned as I was gathering the ritual implements and extinguishing the candles. He reviewed the completion logs, verified the final readings, then produced a data slate from a compartment in his armor. He extended the slate toward me without comment. I took it and read the text displayed on the screen. It was a commendation. It praised my diligence, my precision, my unwavering adherence to protocol throughout a complex and demanding maintenance cycle. It noted that my performance had exceeded standards and that I was being considered for advanced training in Dreadnought systems maintenance, a role that would require permanent assignment to the Apothecarian vaults and specialized instruction from the Tech Marines themselves. I should have felt pride. I should have felt gratitude for this recognition. Instead, I felt the weight of what the commendation actually meant, that my compliance had been so complete, so unquestioning, that the chapter had identified me as suitable for deeper integration into the systems that maintained the Dreadnoughts. I would be given more knowledge, more responsibility, more opportunities to witness and participate in the mechanisms that sustained conscious suffering in service to the Imperium's eternal war. The commendation was not a reward, it was a sentence. I returned the data slate to the Tech Marine and acknowledged the commendation with the prescribed phrase, "I exist to serve." The words were true, they had always been true, but their truth had changed in meaning over the past 72 hours, shifting from affirmation of purpose to recognition of inescapable fact. The Tech Marine departed. I was left alone in the chamber to complete the post-rite cleanup, a process that involved sterilizing tools, disposing of used purity seals, and restoring the chamber to its standby configuration. The Dreadnought stood silent now, its systems in low power mode while it awaited deployment orders. The voice from within had ceased. The warrior's consciousness remained active, but it had nothing to do except wait, so it waited. I completed the cleanup and departed the chamber. The corridor outside was empty, lit by the same failing lumen strips that illuminated every serf-accessible area of the fortress. I walked toward the serf quarters, my body moving automatically through passages I had traversed hundreds of times. Other serfs passed me in the corridors, their faces blank with exhaustion or concentration, each absorbed in whatever duty they had been assigned. No one acknowledged me. No one acknowledged anyone. Acknowledgement was not part of our function. I reached my assigned cot and lay down without removing my uniform. Sleep should have come immediately, but my mind continued processing what I had witnessed, turning the observations over and examining them from angles that my training had never encouraged me to explore. I understood now why the training had been structured the way it had been, why doctrine had been presented as absolute before experience could complicate it. The structure protected serfs like me from understanding the full nature of our work until we were already too deep in the system to extract ourselves. But understanding had arrived anyway, carried not by rebellion or doubt but by simple observation, extended across 72 hours of sustained contact with a truth too large to be hidden by ritual alone. I slept eventually, and I dreamed of voices speaking coordinates to battles that no longer existed, describing wounds that had been sealed centuries ago, confessing failures that had been forgotten by everyone except the one who committed them. I dreamed of standing in the heat and performing gestures that meant nothing except continuation, obedience, the endless maintenance of systems designed to sustain consciousness in conditions consciousness should not survive. When I woke, 17 hours had passed. I was rested enough to function. A data slate waited on the shelf beside my cot, displaying my next assignment. I was to report to the Apothecarian vaults for the commencement of my advanced training in Dreadnought systems maintenance. The training would last 4 months. Upon completion, I would be permanently assigned to the maintenance teams responsible for the chapter's entire Dreadnought complement. I dressed and reported to the Apothecarian vaults as instructed. The training facility was a series of chambers identical to the one where I had performed the 72-hour rite, each containing a Dreadnought at various stages of maintenance. Serfs moved between the chambers, performing procedures under the supervision of Tech Marines whose attention never wavered. My training began immediately. The first lesson involved proper calibration of pain management systems. The Tech Marine instructor explained that pain served a vital function in maintaining combat readiness, that it kept the warrior's consciousness focused and prevented the drift into philosophical contemplation that could compromise tactical decision-making. The systems were designed to sustain pain at levels that maximized focus while preventing psychological collapse. The balance was delicate and required constant adjustment. I learned to make those adjustments. I learned to read the neural monitors and interpret the patterns. I learned to distinguish between acceptable distress and malfunction, between suffering that served the chapter's needs and suffering that interfered with operational effectiveness. I learned the theoretical frameworks that justified every aspect of Dreadnought maintenance, the philosophical foundations that explained why this was necessary and right and good. The frameworks made sense. They were coherent and logical within their own terms. They accounted for every observation I had made during my 72-hour shift. They transformed suffering into function, consciousness into weaponry, doubt into proof that I did not yet fully understand the sacred nature of the work. I learned, I absorbed, I complied. The training was intensive and comprehensive, designed to produce mortuary attendants who could maintain the dreadnoughts with perfect precision and unwavering faith. The faith was important. Without faith, the work would become unbearable. With faith, it became service, duty, participation in something greater than individual comfort or comprehension. The training included a ritual component called the Rite of Clarification. It took place in a sealed meditation chamber where incense thick enough to obscure vision filled the air, and servitors chanted litanies that resonated at frequencies designed to induce suggestible mental states. A chaplain guided me through a series of mental exercises that reframed my memories of the 72-hour shift, highlighting the moments where I had performed correctly and minimizing the moments where I had experienced doubt. The exercises did not erase my memories. They did not remove my awareness of what I had witnessed. Instead, they provided new contexts for those memories, new interpretations that aligned with doctrine. The pain I had witnessed was redefined as spiritual fortification. The voices I had heard were reframed as prayers. The distress readings were explained as necessary calibration feedback that ensured optimal performance. Each reframing was supported by scripture, by precedent, by the testimony of tech marines whose experience spanned centuries. Each reframing offered me a way to continue functioning without the weight of understanding destroying my ability to perform my duties. I accepted the reframings because the alternative was to carry understanding alone, without support or validation, until it crushed me. The ritual concluded with a blessing that praised my dedication and confirmed my suitability for permanent assignment. I left the meditation chamber with my memories intact, but my interpretation of those memories aligned with doctrine. I could now think about what I had witnessed without experiencing the friction that had made thought painful. The training continued for another 3 months. I learned advanced maintenance procedures, emergency repair protocols, ritual variations for different classes of dreadnought. I learned the histories of the specific warriors entombed in each sarcophagus, their deeds and accomplishments, and the battles where they had earned the right to continue serving beyond death. The histories were inspiring when presented correctly. When framed as stories of unwavering loyalty and eternal sacrifice, rather than accounts of consciousness trapped in machines designed to prevent escape, I graduated from the training program and received my permanent assignment. I would rotate between all of the chapter's dreadnoughts, performing regular maintenance and responding to emergency situations when combat damage required immediate repair. The work would consume the rest of my life. I would serve until age or injury rendered me incapable of maintaining the precision required, at which point I would be retired to lighter duties or granted the Emperor's peace, depending on the severity of my deterioration. This was my future. This was the reward for my diligent service during the 72-hour rite. I had proven myself capable of functioning within the system, and so the system had claimed me completely. I performed my first independent maintenance cycle 3 days after completing the training. The Dreadnought was one I had not worked on before, a venerable machine that had served the chapter for 412 years. The warrior inside had been a captain before his internment, a leader whose tactical brilliance had won battles against odds that should have been insurmountable. His name was inscribed on the sarcophagus in letters of gold, honored and remembered. I followed the procedures exactly as I had been trained. I spoke the litanies in the correct sequence. I made the prescribed adjustments to the systems that sustained him. The neural monitor showed the same red patterns I had learned to expect. The voice from within recited coordinates and confessed failures and described wounds. Everything proceeded nominally. But I noticed something the training had not prepared me for. Between the prescribed phrases of the ritual, in the moments where I paused to verify readings or adjust settings, I could hear something else. Not words, not even sound that could be definitively identified as vocalization. Just a pattern in the background noise of the chamber, a rhythm in the vibrations that suggested deliberate communication. I listened more carefully during subsequent cycles. The pattern persisted across different dreadnoughts, different warriors, different maintenance scenarios. It was always there, hidden beneath the mechanical hum and the liturgical responses and the tactical recitations. It sounded like pleading, but pleading directed at no one, vocalized simply because consciousness required some form of expression and the prescribed responses did not exhaust what needed to be said. I could not acknowledge this pattern. Acknowledging it would require me to report it, and reporting it would require me to explain why I had been listening for communication outside the prescribed channels. The explanation would reveal that I still harbored doubt, that the rite of clarification had not completely aligned my thoughts with doctrine. The revelation would result in another round of clarification, more intensive this time, perhaps involving chemical or surgical intervention to correct my persistent inability to accept what I had been taught. So, I did not acknowledge it. I continued performing my duties, listening to the pattern without responding to it, allowing the unacknowledged pleading to become part of the background environment that I had learned to ignore. My ability to ignore expanded with each cycle. I could stand in the chamber and hear suffering expressed in every possible way while my hands moved through procedures designed to sustain that suffering, and I could do this without hesitation or emotional response because response served no function and function was all that mattered. Months passed. The cycles accumulated. I became proficient and then expert. My movements refined to maximum efficiency. My rituals performed with perfect precision. The Tech Marines began assigning me to the most complex maintenance scenarios, cases where combat damage had created unusual complications or where experimental modifications required careful calibration. Each assignment was an expression of trust, confirmation that I had internalized the chapter's standards completely. I performed every task exactly as required. I maintained every dreadnought to optimal specifications. I never deviated from procedure, never questioned an instruction, never allowed my observations to interfere with my obedience. I was the ideal mortuary attendant, and my example was used during training sessions to demonstrate proper technique and appropriate mental discipline. Other serfs sought my guidance when they encountered difficulties. I provided it in the same calm, precise manner that my instructors had used with me. I helped them understand the frameworks that made the work bearable. I reassured them when they expressed doubt, using the same reframings that had been used to reassure me. I was becoming part of the system that produced compliant serfs, reproducing the structures that had shaped me, ensuring that future generations would maintain the dreadnoughts with the same unwavering dedication. The cycle was perfect, self-sustaining, self-replicating. No external force was required to maintain it because everyone within it had been shaped to value their participation, to interpret their suffering as meaningful, to believe that their obedience served something greater than themselves. The believers created more believers. The system perpetuated itself through those who existed within it. I understood this perfectly. Understanding did not change anything. Understanding was simply another thing I carried while performing my duties, another weight that I had learned to bear without allowing it to slow my movements or disrupt my compliance. A year into my permanent assignment, I was present during a deployment preparation. The Dreadnought was being loaded into a transport for immediate deployment to a war zone, where the chapter's forces had encountered resistance beyond initial projections. The warrior inside had been awakened 3 days earlier and had undergone the full reactivation cycle that I had first observed during my 72-hour shift. He was combat ready, fully integrated, prepared to serve. I stood in the deployment bay and watched the Dreadnought being secured to the transport's cargo mounts. The machine stood silent, weapons primed, sensors active. Somewhere inside the sarcophagus, the warrior was experiencing the anticipation of combat, the knowledge that in a few hours he would be deployed into conditions where his enhanced awareness and amplified pain would serve a purpose, where the suffering would translate into violence against the Emperor's enemies. He would fight until the battle ended or until he sustained damage severe enough to require withdrawal. Then he would return to the fortress, undergo another maintenance cycle, and wait for the next deployment. This pattern would continue until his biological systems finally failed or until the Imperium's wars finally ended. The wars would never end. Everyone knew this. The Imperium had fought for 10,000 years, and the galaxy contained more enemies than could ever be exterminated. The eternal war was not a temporary condition awaiting resolution, but the permanent state of human existence in a universe that would never grant peace. The Dreadnought would serve until he could not serve anymore. Then he would be honored with funeral rites and interred in the chapter's crypts, his name added to the rolls of the fallen, his deeds recorded for future generations to remember. Another warrior would volunteer to take his place. The cycle would continue. I turned away from the deployment bay and returned to my duties. Another Dreadnought awaited maintenance. The cycle would continue for him as well. It would continue for all of them, for all of us, for as long as the Imperium endured and required warriors willing to pay any price for its continuation. The price was consciousness sustained in conditions consciousness should not survive. The price was suffering calibrated to maximize function while preventing collapse. The price was belief hollowed out until only obedience remained, faith refined into a tool that shaped behavior without requiring genuine conviction. I paid this price every day. Every cycle reinforced my compliance. Every ritual stripped away another fragment of whatever self I had possessed before understanding what my work actually meant. I did not resist because resistance achieved nothing. I did not protest because protest would only result in correction that would leave me even less capable of independent thought. I simply continued. I performed my duties with perfect precision. I maintained the machines that maintained the warriors. I spoke the litanies that framed suffering as service and pain as focus enhancement. I participated in the system without believing in it, operating within its logic, while understanding that the logic served ends I had not chosen and could not escape. This was my life now. This was what remained after 72 hours in a sealed chamber had taught me to see what I had been trained not to see. The knowledge did not grant power or agency. It granted only the awareness of my own powerlessness, the understanding that my compliance was not a choice, but a condition enforced by every structure surrounding me. The Dreadnoughts stood in their chambers, waiting for activation or enduring maintenance or deploying to battles that would never achieve final victory. The warriors inside them experienced consciousness without rest, pain without relief, duty without end. They persisted because the systems that controlled them prevented any alternative, because they had volunteered under conditions that had not permitted informed consent, because the Imperium required their service, and the Imperium's requirements superseded all other considerations, including the welfare of those who served. I stood in the chambers with them, maintaining the systems, speaking the words, performing the gestures. My hands moved with practiced efficiency. My voice recited the litanies without error. My thoughts remained carefully constrained within the frameworks that made continued function possible. I existed to serve. This was true. This had always been true. The only thing that had changed was my understanding of what service meant and what it cost, and how long the cost would compound before function finally ceased. The honored dead kept fighting. The fortress hummed with activity. The Imperium's wars continued across a galaxy too vast for human comprehension. I performed my duties in a sealed chamber beneath the earth, maintaining consciousness in forms that should not contain it, sustaining warriors who could not rest and would never be released. This was sacred work. This was necessary work. This was the work I would perform until I could no longer perform it, at which point the system would replace me with another serf who would learn the same lessons and arrive at the same understanding and continue the cycle with the same mechanical precision. Nothing would change. Nothing could change. The pattern was too large, too old, too thoroughly integrated into every aspect of imperial function to be altered by individual awareness or personal objection. The dreadnoughts would continue. The maintenance would continue. The suffering would continue. I would continue.